Okay, welcome everyone to another virtual event sponsored by the Center for Religious Diversity and Public Life here at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. My name is Jeff Scholes. I'm the director of the center and a faculty member of the philosophy department here at UCCS. We are very pleased to have Dr. Richard Newton with us here today for our event entitled Roots in Religion, a conversation with Dr. Richard Newton. We'll be discussing Dr. Newton's book, Identifying Roots, Alex Haley and the Anthropology of Scriptures, published by Equinox Press last year. Just a couple things about the event itself. It's being recorded, so you can watch it later, or if you have friends that were not able to watch it, they can watch it as well on the UCCS YouTube channel. I'll speak with Dr. Newton in a more conversational style as opposed to maybe an interview style for about 45 minutes. And then for the last 15 minutes, I'll ask him questions that you, the audience members, have submitted through the chat section of the YouTube or the comments section down below. So at that point, I'll pull up that video and look through some of the questions and hopefully get to ask him some that you have. And so we'll end at 3 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. So we'll go for an hour, just FYI. And also before I introduce Dr. Newton, I want to thank Bradley Plez, who's doing all the tech stuff, and Margie Oldham in the LAS Dean's office, who helped with registration and promotion. Thank you both. You made this happen. Okay, Dr. Newton is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama. Dr. Newton investigates the role of scriptures in identity formation and social difference. He received his PhD in critical comparative scriptures from Claremont Graduate University and has research interests in theory and method in the study of religion, African American intellectual history, and the New Testament in the Western imagination, and pedagogy and religious studies. In addition to an array of publications in scholarly journals and edited volumes, Newton's insights have been featured in local, national, and international media outlets. You can learn more about his research and pedagogy at his social media professional site, Sowing the Seed, Fruitful Conversations in Religion, Culture, and Teaching. And you can go to sowingtheseed.org to find out more information about this really remarkable thing he's doing. Richard, it is a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So I want to start by, as I told you in our little chat before this, that anyone over the age of 60 is likely familiar with Roots, primarily probably through watching the television miniseries in 1977 or by reading the book that came out, I believe, the year before in 76. But for anyone who's not familiar with the phenomena of Alex Haley's Roots, I wonder if you could just start by talking about it in general.
So I think one way to center the importance of roots in American culture is to think about that name African American. Often when race is asked for on an official document, when it's there to identify someone, you'll often see the choice Black or African American. Now, the group of people being described have been known by many different names. Some names they called themselves, other names were put upon them. But African American is a term that was one of those in which these people claimed themselves. And part of that is because of this roots discourse that didn't start with Alex Haley's Roots, but Alex Haley's Roots really defined that. The idea that Black people didn't just come from some void or from some spot we don't want to talk about in American history, but actually they have a past that is worthwhile, that's usable, for all its ups and downs, also is extremely valuable, and it starts in Africa. Alex Haley's Roots was a multimedia event, a social media phenomena before social media that really showed America that this was the case because it put an all-Black cast, perhaps for the first time, in front of American audiences and readership as the paragons of American history. And so as you watch Black people telling this story, living this story, demonstrating this story in the highest terms, America is able to sort of reimagine and redream what it means to be an American and who can be an American. And Alex Haley's Roots kind of is the playbook for how that works in the late 20th century.
Excellent. Thank you. I also was talking to you this a little before we start talking. I write on religion and pop culture, so I'm aware of the difficulty that at least much of the academy has had with taking pop culture artifacts seriously, like Roots. Roots is obviously more than that. But so I guess what piqued your interest? Have you seen a change in the Academy's reception of treating and dealing with pop culture? And B, what piqued your interest into writing about Haley's roots?
I think one of the things that's happening in the Academy right now, and you could say that it's happening just in the way that we human beings are processing media in the information age, is that the line between popular culture and culture is really, one could say, shifting, but also going away, maybe rightfully so. I mean, especially when you think about sort of the film industry and how most of the stuff that's coming out is a remake or a reboot of something else that was once popular, but now being presented in a way that teaches us greater truths and shows us the story from a different point of view, and reflects more complicated things about ourselves. What I saw in Alex Haley's Roots was a reflection of how people look at this notion of scriptures. I was coming from a biblical studies background. In my doctoral work and in my prior graduate and undergraduate work, I was very much interested in what people were doing with the Bible. And also the move to try to get back to, for instance, like the historical Jesus, like what was Jesus doing in the first century? But that move to try to get back to where the action actually happened and get the story right, that impulse is not a natural impulse, right? We're taught to get back to the root of the matter, to get back to where it started, to get back to origins. And as I started to explore that question more of why do we even care to go back to the beginning to lay claims to origins, I'll be honest, I flailed around in my graduate seminars trying to find the best way to articulate my questions and sort of hypotheses about this. And I really didn't hit my stride with it until I kind of threw up my hands and was like, let me play around with this idea of roots. I've seen this book on my bookshelf in my parents' house, like all growing up. I knew the miniseries. I had to watch it in elementary school. Everyone I seemed to know knew the miniseries. I saw references in popular culture, television, movie, music, etc., all around Roots and its main character, Kunta Kinte. And so I was like, well, what's going on with that? And what if that would be a great example of this impulse we have to not only get back to origins, but also to do so through like authoritative media like books. And so I was like, what if we think about roots as scripture and then start thinking about scriptures as roots? And I've been working through that problem or question ever since.
Nice, thank you. I remember I was 6, I think, when it came out, and I remember it was on in our parents' home, but I did not understand it at that point, but went back and watched it. But anyway, no, thank you. So you talk about, you just towards the end here about scriptures, and obviously that's in the title of the book, the anthropology of scriptures. First of all, can you tell us what you mean by this phrase, anthropology of scriptures? And second, how is Roots, in a way, as you say, scripture, and vice versa, as you're saying, scripture as Roots?
So the question of like what is a scripture is one that's been raised in a number of spaces. So the one scholar I'm thinking of in particular was a comparativist and an Islamicist named Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who wrote a book called What is Scripture, and tried to take a comparative approach through the world religions to think about, well, what do we mean by scriptures, especially as a label for the Bible and the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and these other texts. Often sacred text, right? That's the sort of elision that happens there. Scripture equals sacred text. But then you also, especially for those who are interested in like popular culture, know that people find meaning and orientation through other texts, through other media, and could even talk about the way that those things are scriptural for them. I mean, if you go into like a Christian bookstore, or look at some of the media that comes out in different religious curricula, there's often this sort of and put in there, like the Bible and Harry Potter, the Bible and, Hunger Games or Twilight or Percy Jackson. This idea that what is important about scripture is the way that it's connected to culture. It's like that religion and culture idea. For me, though, I wanted to get away from just add the holy and stir kind of idea to scripture. And I wanted to see, well, what's going on with people? My interest in my scholarship is all around this religion as a thing that people do, and religion as a part of culture. Like, you can't really talk about religion as separate from culture. It's a label, it's a term that has a history connected to what a certain group of people did and how they understood the world. Scripture similarly speaks to a dynamic that separates some books in people's minds from other books, or some media from people's perspectives from others. And so the way that I kind of think about the anthropology of scriptures is looking at the way that people not only read texts, but how some of those cultural texts seem to read them back. This idea that there's a fine line between making a difference and making a difference in the world, and that we're going to go to a source, a book, some form of media to tell us how this works. And that's sort of what I'm thinking of in terms of scriptures and scriptures as roots, right? Wherever we see that kind of guidance or direction, where we get to the root of the matter and what is significant, we're often looking at resources that tell us so accordingly.
Nice. Thank you for that. So it sounds like the anthropology part of the anthropology of scriptures is really bringing the human into it, both as the reader and as that which is, as you say, read back. It's kind of like a dual hermeneutic to some degree. Is
Right.
that safe to say? Okay.
Right, because if you think about the way even the term scriptures is invoked in our political discourse, we know that all sorts of groups have texts they use to orient themselves. We know that even some of the groups that, like my religious studies students study, will identify other religious traditions or other people groups as having text or having scriptures, even though that group doesn't agree with the other group's scriptures. But what is it that they're identifying then that says, oh yeah, this is those people's scriptures. This is that people's Bible. This is that people's like Quran. You know what I mean? Like what's going on in that sort of history, which is actually sort of part of the history of religion, right? That there are explorers who are going around the world discovering new worlds and saying, oh yeah, they have a Bible too. They have a scripture too. It's not our scripture and they're wrong for it, but they have one. Well, what do they have exactly? And that's what I sort of wanted to explore, is that like, what do you see in that other group of people that's worth naming and mentioning and considering?
Thank you. I wonder if you've wrestled with the possibility that kind of this widening out of how you're defining scripture endangers at least some people's notion of what correctly qualifies as scripture, or is that not a danger, or how you can avoid that danger, or is it even something we should be worried about?
Well, I mean, I think danger is important. Whenever we're thinking about people, danger is important and vital because it shows us what is important for us, right? It's kind of like the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin talks about, and he says this in a number of his different television shows. Like they'll talk about the third rail of politics, and the quip is always, you know, X issue is the third rail of politics, but the third rail is where the power is. When we start talking about something as dangerous, that should give us pause to ask why. What is so threatening? And of course, what is so powerful? What potential lies in that reconsideration or conceptualization? For me, when we start thinking about scriptures in broader terms than the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, whatever people want to insert as their example of scriptures, one, it's forcing us to reconsider some of our assumptions, but also to get into a place where we can think about quite clearly and intentionally about, why am I so concerned with propriety? What are the stakes? What are the boundaries? So if you say, or if you acknowledge that a group's central orienting text, or this activity they're doing with a cultural text, is a scripture, and it rubs you the wrong way, what's the cost and benefit of that? What are the issues at play? How are we taught to see it otherwise? And that's exactly what I want to get at with this sort of anthropology of scriptures. I mean, that's why Group A and Group B can read the same text and yet come with vastly different ideas about what that text means. President Trump and President Obama both can take their oaths of office on the Lincoln Bible, even though they have radically different politics. How does that work? Why does that seem to work for so many people? And what are the stakes? That's what I want to get at with this agenda I'm calling the anthropology of scriptures.
Nice, nice. Let me read a section from your book. Here it is for those that are curious. So it's a wonderful book. This is on page 15. Taking root refers to the means by which the grief of uproot is overshadowed by the resolve to make a scenario work in one's favor. It is to actively engage in discourses whose net success brings a sense of being at home. Wonderful couple sentences. I'm wondering if you could talk about this dynamic between uprootedness and at least a feeling of being at home, and how it relates to your interpretation of roots.
So I think what roots does for the American people, not just in 1976 and 77, but ever since, is that there is a scenario in which the reader, the one who's engaging the narrative, can say that life is hard, that their circumstances have been difficult, that they have had challenges, but there is possibility beyond those challenges, and they can lay claim to something that's going to direct them toward those possibilities. I think in very dramatic terms, one could say people know what it means to be uprooted and yet want to desire to take root at the same time. And what are the things that we hold on to, that we lay claim to, that we grasp, that move us toward that ability and that circumstance where we can finally be at home, at rest, and take root. If you think about when Roots came about, 1976, the last quarter of 1976, so October of 76 is when the book comes out. The miniseries comes out in January of 77. We're talking about right after the Civil Rights Movement. This is really the post-Civil Rights Movement, and sociologist Michael Eric Dyson talks about how if our laws changed, if America had changed its laws regarding race, Alex Haley's Roots really changed our hearts, because it sort of showed the spirit of America rather than just the letter of America. This idea that you can come from anywhere, have gone through any hardship, even experienced hardship on these shores, and yet if you're perseverant and continuing to sort of route your way through, you too can take root in this place of great dreaming, possibility, opportunity, right? Freedom and the like. All the refrains that we who are patriotic about this country know chapter and verse. And Roots presents a way in which Black people are able to do this, and a way in which Black people are able to do this in the eyes of those who were, in a lot of ways, oppressing them or taking advantage of a story that served to oppress them. And so I think Roots, this idea of being able to take root, the promise that this kind of text presents readers, is really exciting for readers and challenges readers to figure out, how too can I do this?
And in part of it too, I mean, Alex Haley was successful, and so he's almost attempting to say, look at me, given where my family started. I mean, was it a part of his intention to present this, in particular, post-civil rights movement, where there is obviously more African-American mobility than the 70s, still not enough, but it's kind of like a shining example of an individual who traced the family history to this point, to a successful African-American. Is that part of his intention?
Absolutely. I mean, in my view anyway, and he's pretty explicit about this as well, particularly when we think about the other text for which Alex Haley is really well known for, and that's the autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. That last part people forget, but the autobiography of Malcolm X was the product of an exchange between Alex Haley, who was a popular journalist who'd been writing in a lot of conservative news outlets and media outlets, magazines that you'd have, around your table, Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, and the like. He was writing stories and also doing interviews with famous Black people. He was writing about Black people of note to give America, particularly white America, a window into what Black people were doing beyond whatever white people thought Black people were doing. And there was a large swath of the American reading public who was very interested in the stories Alex Haley was sharing about figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Wilma Rudolph, all these people, and including Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X and Alex Haley had some radically different politics in a lot of ways, even though they were about the same age. But Malcolm X had sort of had his awakening and served his ministry through the Nation of Islam, and then later his own sort of movement in Islam. Alex Haley had come up through the CME, the at the time Colored Methodist Episcopal or Christian Methodist Episcopal. His parents came up through historically black colleges and universities. His father was a professor with a graduate degree from Cornell in agriculture. So his family was very much on the route of not only economic and social upward mobility, but he represented what W.B. Du Bois called the talented 10th. And Alex Haley, in his own life, saw himself as being able to have good relationships with a lot of white people and see integration as not only a possibility, but an American imperative, contra what he was seeing in the messages of Malcolm X. And so Haley had this idea that he would not only interview Malcolm X, but he would also sort of reveal Malcolm X's agenda, what he seemed to be is hyper-black nationalist and segregationist, reveal it for what it is, and that would move people toward the moderate notions that were being presented by the civil rights movement at large via figures like Martin Luther King Jr. That integration would be what white America would know should be the real way forward. Now, as they were having these conversations, it's worth noting that Malcolm X and Alex Haley realized they have a lot in common. They swapped stories. Alex Haley became the godfather to Malcolm's children. In a lot of ways, Malcolm realized, like, I could be that, and vice versa. Like, what is it that puts us in these somewhat opposite positions? And Malcolm, of course, takes on the X, leaves his Christian name behind, and says, I'm going to adopt this new lineage that has its roots in black people as being the creation of God and white people being, frankly, the devil. Or, as he later sort of said, white people have come to learn to act like the devil and treat black people as objects and slaves and chattel. What do we do about that? And Alex Haley is like, I know where I came from, and my family had done this, this, and this. And if you follow in this sort of vein, you too can take root in America. You need not drop an X. You can take your name and live into the American dream fully. And he's able to do that because he knows where he comes from. And so that's very much a sort of idea that's at play with Alex Haley's story, and the possibilities, not just for black people, but for all those who should wonder how they got here, why it's so hard, and how they can come into America.
Thank you. Fantastic. I didn't realize all that. That's amazing. It's kind of like a dialectic between the two, where they kind of arrive at at least recognition of more similarity than difference, it sounds like. I wonder if Malcolm actually knew that Alex's original intentions were to kind of undermine his radical politics by presenting a scary version of it.
Well, I think a couple things are worth noting. I mean, I think at one level, yes, Malcolm X is absolutely aware of what Alex Haley is about, what his politics are. Alex Haley served in the Coast Guard. Alex Haley was a staunch Republican politically. Malcolm X knew Alex Haley. The Nation of Islam knew Alex Haley's work and what he was about. In Malcolm X's eyes, I believe, as the masterful spokesman he was, he knew that the opportunity to have his message heard in a larger audience could only really benefit him. And, truth be told, the autobiography of Malcolm X is about a figure who was on the FBI's watch list and yet now is on AP reading lists, right? It's now a book that many white people identify as a turning point in their lives. Time magazine names it one of the most important books of the 20th century. So yeah, having his message be put out, regardless of how fiery or radical people characterized it, was part of a calculus that Malcolm X was okay with. Also, Alex Haley took poetic license, especially after the murder of Malcolm X, to sort of edit Malcolm X into a figure who has a sort of conversion away from Black nationalism toward the ideals of integration, which I don't think is a fair characterization of Malcolm X's politics. I think it was a little bit more complicated than that. But it does present a sort of prelude to the story that Alex Haley will eventually tell about himself being able to find his furthest back person, right? The person who came from Africa, who was sent from Africa, who was sold from Africa into slavery in the United States, but yet was able to birth a new tribe that became Alex Haley's family.
Thank you. So this next question could kind of segue from what you just said. So you play with these three terms, which you've mentioned before: uproot, root, and root or route. Let's call it route for the sake of lack of confusion. R-U-O-T-E, R-O-U-T-E. Quite a bit in your book. And I thought that I was telling you earlier, I thought one of the most interesting chapters in your book is how you apply these three terms to Kunta Kinte, the character, obviously, in the real life person, but also character presented in the book, as seen through quite a few pop cultural expressions, such as the comedy of Richard Pryor, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the movie Black Panther, the rapper Kendrick Lamar, to name a few. Can you tell us more about how these pop cultural artifacts help us understand the character of Kunta Kinte?
So for me, especially as someone who was born, quite a bit of ways after Roots came out on television and the book, my entry into this mythology represented by Roots came by way of these other references in a lot of ways. And I think that's the case for many people. And if you're like, well, that discounts it as scripture, that's exactly what happens with all the other examples of scripture with which most people are familiar with, right? You see, the greatest story ever told. You go to hear the stories told to you orally, and then you're told to go buy the book. This is actually pretty common in terms of the sort of pedagogy of scriptures. Well, Alex Haley's Roots, its import is not just, lots of people bought it, which they did, or lots of people seen it, which they have. It's in the fact that people haven't been able to let go of it, and they don't even know when they're referencing it. I think the success of Roots is that it has sort of become part of the lexicon of American dreaming and imagining, so that you have, for 40 years now, constant citation of Roots in all these different ways, whether it's Richard Pryor riffing on a heckler and calling a heckler who's in the sort of rafters of the theater Kunta Kinte because he's so far away, whether it's in Will Smith talking about Kunta Kinte to riff, to sort of blast another character in his sitcom, or Colin Kaepernick making a very strong statement about anti-Black police brutality and wearing a Kunta Kinte shirt, or the idea that Black Panther would be a wildly successful film centered around a Black cast that would show scenes in which there's a kind of cosmic notion of Black identity in the fathers and gods before. I mean, Roots lays the template for a lot of that in the popular imagination. Lion King 2. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which we see this Roots dramatization play out. And a scripture is only so powerful as the people who engage it, and that people have not been able to leave Roots behind, whether they're looking at Alex Haley's work or following Henry Louis Gates and getting their DNA tested to see where they come from and what that has to tell them about their future, is a part of the Roots impulse that they learned from somewhere. And that learning and assuming about the importance of where we come from and having to know where we come from to know where we're going is part and parcel to me of the anthropology of scriptures.
Thank you. And it's fantastic. So shifting gears a little bit, the energy behind Haley's search for his origin is largely an individual journey, right? It has social consequences and future consequences, as you've just been speaking of. Can what I'll generally call like social stories, or those involving the long history of African American activism, those that, say, for instance, led to the current Black Lives Matter movement, as social movements, can they draw on the same kind of energy that Haley, as an individual, kind of had at his disposal? In other words, the origin points of some of these movements. Can they draw on it, or is it two really different things, the individual versus the social?
Thinking anthropologically, I think there's always a both and there. So, you mentioned the sort of Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, a couple of things are interesting to me about the formation of the movement, the hashtag, the phenomena that's become, and the commodity it's become, frankly. And that is, Roots has been a large part of that. Not necessarily Alex Haley's roots, but the idea that they're roots to a problem, roots to the true identity of Black people that are part of like how they matter, why they matter, and the disconnect between those two things is something that gets interrogated by that simple yet complex phrase, Black Lives Matter. There is always the sort of individual, but the individual is constructed from the social and even the individual identities to which we lay hold, that we say are our roots, are socially informed and constructed as well. And so I think it's important, and this was important for me in thinking about Alex Haley, to not just hear or read what he had to say, but also to think about him as a figure in a larger moment of time. I mean, this was what was so important for me about reading him next to Malcolm X and seeing that, yes, these two men are similar but different, and to try to maintain the tension, because all we have as human beings are tension. Tension can be great, tension can be devastating, but tension is what sort of holds this network of meaning making together, right? These are the tendrils between all of us. And the way that we push and pull and tug at this stuff is how we make the world go round. Alex Haley seems to be able to do this in a pretty powerful way through his pen. And of course, through the way his pen and his words have been adapted into miniseries sequels, into reboots, into homages and artwork and the like.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little about the television miniseries. I'm guessing, you can say a little bit more about how exactly popular it was for those that weren't around in 1977 or after that. I've just been thinking about it before this interview. I was thinking of that show, I Wonder, in 77 as a kind of Rorschach test, in particular when you're comparing Black and white communities watching it. And how one reacted to it would tell you quite a bit about how you viewed race, or whether there's even a, quote, race problem or not, right? I'm thinking more from the white community. Obviously, many whites would have benefited still to this day by reading the book, but the watching of the violent, there's some really very, very difficult scenes in the miniseries that are, meant to represent reality, but nevertheless, I could envision many whites either not having it visually presented to them ever on a television screen or even a movie theater, and then reacting with the typical either guilt or kind of dispossession of it. Those were my forefathers. What do I have to do with it? So there's those different kinds of reactions. I'm thinking more from the white community watching and or reading Roots. What do you think about that, and perhaps the differences between many in the African-American community feeling confidence and pride watching it, and probably many in the white community feeling shame or just rejecting the whole story altogether, or saying that's a part of the past, what does that have to do with me now, which is a common refrain from Mitch McConnell et al., as we've heard relatively recently.
Mm-hmm. The appeal of Roots, and I don't mean here like the enjoyment of Roots or something like that, or what makes Roots great. I'm not out here trying to get people to read Roots. But part of the appeal of the Roots discourse is the framing of, frankly, history, American history, in a way that keeps people in the room, engaged, enmeshed in tensions about these issues that you've been naming, like as race, right? So white people watched Roots, and some saw it as like, oh, there's no way this could happen. Some saw it as like, oh yeah, we know it happened. Like, we're well aware that it happened. And this is just laying it out and bringing receipts. Others, somewhere in between, trying to wrestle with it, right? So you could say, for white audiences, watching Roots uprooted them, routed them, and allowed them to take root in a new integrated America in a way that they were struggling to. All of that happened because it kept so many people in front of the screen. So in January 77, when Roots is displayed, we have to remember this is not the era of reruns or like live streaming, as my 9-year-old called it, selection television, where you can just choose whatever's on TV at a time. I was like, no, you got to be there in front of the screen at a certain time. And people were doing this night after night after night. So many people that, like, the record was above the number for the Super Bowl. Like, that's how many people were watching Roots. Bars were closed or showing Roots. Las Vegas Strip casinos, empty. People were watching Roots. Now, part of this is because it was a very cold January. So what else are you going to do when it's cold? But also, there was going to be a thing that's never been done, and it truly was must-see television. And people were, like, just pulled to it. And I think that's part of the dynamics of scriptures is the way that the framing of narratives in light of political and social conditions pulls us to and pulls our attention. And that's what happened for Black and white audiences alike. I can tell you two things of interest that a lot of people forget is that there were a lot of arguments that happened around Roots. So my father told me, for instance, how he remembered after certain episodes, especially after Kunta Kinte gets beat and whipped over and over, and he's forced to say his name, his Christian name, right, Toby, and he refuses, and all of the enslaved people are watching, and they're like, just say Toby, and he's like, no, it's Kunta Kinte, over and over and over until he passes out from consciousness. After that episode, there were fights where Black people, like verbal fights where Black people were like, your people did this to my people. There were white people asking for forgiveness. There was the cast had to go on morning television and be like, look, we're all okay. We're working out through this hard issue. That's how serious this drama was, because it hit home, as Time Magazine said. It really hit home in all these different ways. Black people, yes, many Black people loved this show, watched it, learned from it. It was a moment of pride. It was a moment of awe. It was also a moment of some real questions. I know, for instance, my grandmother, on the occasion of the show coming out, was like, they're not going to tell the whole story. There's no way you could tell the truth about what happened on television for people to watch. And even when she heard it was Alex Haley telling the story, it was kind of like, you can only tell so much. And that's been an argument of Black critics ever since, that it's still not even the whole story. It's still somewhat sanitized and whitewashed and commodified and packaged for a viewing audience. But it was compelling, right? And everything that word means. And I think what's compelling about it for all is that it took the American narrative and told it in a new way, right? Those are the stories we like, right? That's Star Wars. That's all the Marvel movies. That's all of these stories that we watch over and over and over again. They're not new stories. They're old stories told in new ways with new possibilities. And I think Roots did that. Roots said, as Malcolm X put it, we didn't land here we didn't come here on the Mayflower, right? We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock landed on us. Alex Haley said, but here's what also happened. We too came over on ships. But we somehow were able to make a way out of no way in this new world, come up with a new tribe, and show America its promise and what these founding documents meant, even when the people who created them couldn't possibly imagine what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness really is all about. Alex Haley was like, I will reveal that to you. And it's 1976, bicentennial, happy birthday.
Wow. One quick question. Did Haley always intend for the book to be converted into a television miniseries? It happened so fast after the publication. I'm guessing he was on board.
The Roots miniseries, the rights to the Roots miniseries initially were film rights by Columbia Pictures. He had acquired sort of the idea that it'd be filmed by Columbia, or Columbia acquired the rights to film it prior to him finishing the book. The miniseries went into, and then it didn't pan out as a film because he wasn't done with the book, but he was still finishing the miniseries finishing the book while the miniseries was in pre-production.
Okay. It's
also worth noting that this story was familiar to people because he had talked about it in the articles he was writing in Reader's Digest and elsewhere. He was going on Johnny Carson. He was going on all these shows. He was all over every university giving these lectures about Black history and Roots after sort of the success of Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he was able to kind of tell about his own journey in Odyssey and finding out the history of sort of how far back his successful lineage goes in this country, all the way back to an enslaved African. Initially, Roots wasn't going to be about an enslaved African at all. It was going to just start with Reconstruction and go on from there. It was going to be called Before This Anger. Anger being, basically what Malcolm X represents, right? Or white people and Black people being at odds. He was like, no, there's also a moment, there's also a way in which you can see Black people living alongside white people on into American dreaming the way it should be. Let's get back to Before This Anger. He actually gets inspired by Elias Kazan, a Greek author who wrote a story called America, America, an immigrant story, who talks about roots. And he was like, that's the story I want to tell. It's about roots. And when he remembers, presumably, the stories that his grandmother and his great aunts would tell about their furthest back person in the times of slavery, he's able to say, oh, I'm successful because of something that started way back here. And that's what I've got to reach hold to in order to pull us all forward.
I'm wondering, one more question about the television miniseries. As far as roots being a form of scripture, can you still say watching the miniseries and not reading the book, you can still get some of the effects of, quote, reading scripture, obviously through a different medium, or is something either lost or maybe gained that even amplifies its scriptural quality?
Well, I think the quality, one of the things I try to make clear about scriptures, especially by thinking about it anthropologically, is that it is relational. So there's no like sort of quantum of scriptures, like scripturalness per se, or like how much scripture is this? It's rather the relationship and the activity that we observe in people doing this thing with scriptures, what Cantwell Smith called scripturalizing. For me, it's where we see the uproot and the routing and the taking root all around these media. And I would say that I think we should hold in tension the multimedia facets of Roots, whether people watched it on television, they read the book, they saw it via reference. Hear Kendrick Lamar sing King Kunta, or Kanye West reference him, or whomever. I think all of those are part of the larger scriptural phenomena, because if you think about analogs, right, to scripture, people's relationship with the Bible, we'll say, as the one that so many people are familiar and perhaps take for granted. Part of the Bible's import is that it just seems to be around, right? The Gideons don't need you to read the Bible. They know that when you just recognize that in the drawer in your hotel room is a Bible, something could happen. People know how to sound biblical with words and prayers that aren't actually in the Bible, but it sounds like the King James, and so we better take it seriously. We see this all over the inauguration, right? The presidential inauguration, that is. We also know that people learn through drama and through, the famous movies and all the other depictions of these stories that we're told are at our root, at the root of who we are. That I don't think the multimedia facet takes anything away from it. It perhaps adds to it. But what we need to watch for are the ways that people draw lines about what's proper engagement and who gets to interpret and create and do this kind of thing and who doesn't. Right? Anyone could be Alex Haley. That's part of the appeal of Roots. But not everyone can be Alex Haley. Right? Everyone can write a story that looks like the Bible. But if you do that and get caught and don't, really pull it off, you're going to be called a whole lot of things, including crazy or a heretic or a blasphemous or whatever. You also might be called a prophet. What are the lines that we draw between these people, and where do we learn to draw those lines? I would say we learn to draw those lines through the scriptures that people and authorities carry to help us understand what is authorized in this world and the way that we should be, or even more complicated, who we really are at our root.
And I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm listening, don't worry, but as I'm thinking as you're talking of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, where there were selections being made, obviously, of what part of Jesus' life to be told, the exaggerated role of the Jewish people in the crucifixion. There's choices that he makes, but that movie was so popular, and I'm trusting for some, the first time they're hearing or seeing and hearing this story of Jesus, right? And then maybe they go to the Bible to confirm or deny some of the details in it, but you're never able to get over the images in The Passion of the Christ. And I'm wondering if you saw the Roots TV miniseries and then went back and read the book, whether it would either supplement it or something's lost, or you put it down because it's not as action-packed as the TV miniseries.
Well, I mean, I think that idea is like, I have to keep going back and finding out the real story. Then they've already like reeled you in, right? That's kind of what scriptures do, that you're compelled to keep, you can't shake it. And it's the comparison between Gibson's Passion and Haley's Roots is really fascinating because they both were these media phenomena and multimedia phenomena, I should say at that. Gibson marketed a whole bunch of texts and commentary and such around that, connecting with all these groups. Haley did the same thing. They're both very violent, very graphic. People forget that Alex Haley's Roots displayed women's breasts within the first few minutes on primetime television. And this was shown in elementary school. And there's a lot, there's a lot to unpack there about why that's okay and how and when, right? And what that accomplishes. But like these things that shouldn't be seen before children's eyes, violence and sex and the real story and such. All of a sudden, it's like people are putting their children before the screen and saying, you have to watch this because this is who you are. And in fact, if you look at the reflection in the glow, you saw white children do that and black children do that, and children, frankly, from all over the world. Roots was translated into 24 languages. It really was a phenomena. Gibson's passion as a corollary to this is fascinating too, because if you remember in the Passion, none of it's in English. You have people speaking Aramaic, you have people speaking Greek, you have people speaking Latin, and they're speaking Aramaic, Greek, and Latin at each other. I remember my Greek professor in undergrad being like, this doesn't make any sense. They're not even speaking the same language to each other. And who cares? Because we're all just watching history. We're watching how it actually went down. We're watching a rooted storytelling of this past that's supposed to be so important. That is far more important than comprehension, right? Christian history has only needed people to read, let alone understand text, like for a minute, And same thing with citizenship, right? You only have to know so much. Those who become naturalized citizens in this country, of course, study and have to learn. But if you're born here, you don't have to know anything. You just come out and you're given a piece of paper. That idea that you're just given a piece of paper that says who you are and what you can do and where you can be, that's the scriptural impulse I want to unpack. And Roots just looks obvious to us in some ways. We can remember when, oh my gosh, this is quite the phenomena. But this happens with the Bible, this happens with citizenship, this happens in all sorts of ways. And I want to challenge us all to take a minute and look to see, how do we become so invested in texts that some of these texts read us back? It's a weird thing that people would look to media to tell them who they are and where they should go. But we do it all the time, often without even knowing it.
Even more so with stay at home under the pandemic and streaming services. It's the go-to, especially for younger people, but for others as well. It's becoming even a more powerful medium than I think it was 10 years ago. But so how has working on this book helped you reflect on your own roots, if at all, or whether it's your actual genealogy or just you personally in relationship to the idea of roots?
I think there are a few ways that I've sort of, what's my life like after rereading Roots? There are a few things that come to mind. One is that I'm more suspect of the kind of Roots idea that I need to go back somewhere to find out who I am. I have a great reverence and respect for the past, but that move to have to say, I got to find the source, is always one I know to look out for now. And I try to challenge myself, and I'm challenged by my own work and questions and those I've talked to about like why and how that works. I'm also quite interested in hearing the stories of my elders in a way that I haven't been in the past. I was talking to my aunt the other day, who's the oldest. She's like the matriarch in our family now, with the passing of my grandmother. And like hearing her experience about what Roots is, and also, parents whose parents were enslaved, right? Knowing these stories and the ramifications of these and how one works through history is far more complicated than any textbook can tell you. But it also gives me greater insight into the human. And one of the things that came from that interview that I'm speaking about with my aunt is the question of why. And I've been thinking a lot about how so often we replace why with how. And I think the myths that we keep telling do that trick of replacing why with how. Also, I'm very suspicious about this sort of like, let's look at our DNA to kind of find out who we are. I mean, that move to me is very sketchy. I'm not saying people shouldn't do it. I think it's interesting. But just like I know the politics of history and history writing, you got to know there's politics with reading people's genetics and making a whole world of it. And I mean, we've seen this even with Finding Your Roots. And there was a whole thing where on the PBS show, Finding Your Roots, Henry Louis Gates' show, his show sort of got in trouble because one of the stars, I think it was Ben Affleck or someone, came on, and it turned out that in his past there was a slaveholder, and then they basically edited some of that out, right, to make it more palpable. And then in a Sony information bust, a hack, one of the things that was released was this editing. And so, I mean, like, the past is inconvenient. And what I appreciate about Alex Haley's work, he has a quote, it's not in Roots, but it's in a magazine, it's in an interview about Roots. He says, history, we find ourselves as the victor and the oppressor in history. Like, all of us at one time are the victor and one time the oppressor. And history has a fickle way of determining who we are in what circumstance. Mm-hmm. As much as people want to critique the telling of the past that Haley presents, that insight that we're both the victor and the oppressor at different times, and the fickleness of all of that, to me is really compelling, because it makes me realize that sometimes I don't even know that I am the oppressor. What work does it take for me to be able to realize that my ability to take root somewhere is built upon my having uprooted someone else? And scriptures often tell us not to look.
Right. I'm wondering if you could reflect on kind of the current state of the United States in its relationship, or at the very least what a grappling with roots could or could not do. In particular, what we've seen is not necessarily a rise in numbers of white supremacists, Christian nationalists, obviously the storming of the Capitol building on January 6th. I mean, they were already there, right, even before Donald Trump, but certainly Donald Trump aided with the ease of an expression much more boldly in public. What, if anything, can at least your research, or even beyond your research or outside of your research, tell us about the current state of not only race relations, but the boldness with which some are coming out in ways that we have not seen since the 1960s?
I think what my book and my work would tell us is that it's been here all along. And rather than us having not seen it, or it not existing, or we're too ignorant to know, we've been taught not to look, pay attention, or care. Like, this has all been happening. And, the figures named and the people seen on the screen who are waving this or saying that or wielding that, like, they are part of a tradition, a heritage that is part of the American story. And I guess what my work would say is that at some level, these dynamics are textbook. The idea that a figure could raise a Bible up in the street before having police, spray pepper spray on protesters is textbook. The idea that people could storm the Capitol, a seat of power, and then have a prayer talking about, God being on the side of the white light and helping them dispel the darkness, and the globalist anti-Semitic dog whistle, and all these, and then thanking the police on their way out. That's textbook. Not because it's like, oh, look, America is racist. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that these racial dynamics are part of the boundary lines of American identity in ways we don't even know how to trace, because we've been taught to think, right, this is borrowing from famous geographers, and Jonathan Z. Smith, that the map that we have of America and social relations is the territory. That's how this world was created, rather than it being the creation of what human beings do, right, that our uproot has allowed us to take, or uprooting others has allowed us to take root at the expense of others. I think what my work challenges people to do is to take a minute and to consider racism as not a product of ignorance. That's an easy line to that I think we've disciplined students quite literally to think and see. Racism is not a product of ignorance. Racism is taught. Racism is a discipline. And what's it take to unlearn that? I think it takes something as monumental, as conspicuous, and as subtle as re-examining what we believe to be the roots of our very existence and the how and why we are what we are where we are, and we're able to do what we're able to do.
Thank you. We got time for, I had one more question and then we'll be done. And it's one that hopefully is easy to answer. Just curious, what are you working on now?
So my research is currently looking at, I'm working on a new book that takes a look at the history of religion, but starts that history with the testimonies, witnesses, and experiences of Black people. So like what happens if you start thinking about what religion is, not from, oh, like let's look at the world religions, oh, let's look at this comparison, but rather Black people who had to learn what religion is because their life depended on it, right? And what religion could do for them and to them. Like what happens when you start to re-examine what scriptures are, or truth claims, or myths, or sacred space, or violence and ethics? How might you understand not only religion, but how we make sense of the world, how we find significance in the world and make it for ourselves and others. That's what my new book is on. It's a collection of essays and sort of a critical memoir at the same time. And I hope it will illuminate as well as shade the contemporary moment, but also help us rethink the past we've been told and the futures that we dream for ourselves.
Well, if it's anything like this, I have a feeling it will. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation, which was thankfully dominated by you because that's what I wanted. Thank you so much. Please, if you're interested in this conversation, buy his book, Identifying Roots, Alex Haley and the Anthropology of Scripture by Equinox Press. Well, I hope we get to meet each other in person, either at the AAR or perhaps you can come visit our campus once we're able to be face-to-face. But in the meantime, I'm so glad we got a chance to do this over a computer screen.
Me too. Thank you for everyone who was able to participate and be here, and we're able to give the time. It really means a lot.
Thank you so much, Richard. See you soon.